Today we are discussing the corona crisis, partly the corona crisis, but US elections and US foreign policy after the until and after the elections. And we have two excellent panelists. We have Honorable Robert Wexler with us, and we have Mark Perry. You have their bios in the ad and in our website. So I will just start with some basic questions, some questions to start the discussion. And in the meantime, you can write your questions to the chat box and Q&A box on Zoom. Or if you are following from Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, you can write a comment under that as a question, and my assistants will pick up the questions and send it to me. And let's start with you, Robert Wexler. How do you evaluate the reaction of the Congress to the recent, the killing of Floyd and all the demonstrations that are taking place across the United States? Probably this is the second time that we are seeing Republican senators and congressmen not so much supporting Trump's position. And there was this general idea that they were somehow avoiding to confront President Trump because of the election, etc. And this is an election year. And after the Syria crisis, probably the second time that and COVID, of course, they're not endorsing President Trump. And yesterday, none of the US Republican senators wanted to answer questions about President Trump's attitude the day after those lootings and everything took place in Washington, D.C.
Yes. In fairness to my Republican colleagues, no one likes to see the horrific events that occurred in Minneapolis. That's bipartisan. That's not about being a Democrat or Republican. Everyone understands the horrific tragedy that occurred. The recognition of the source of the evil, of the problem, is a different story. And the willingness to take on the intemperate and the volatile, and in some cases, the inflaming behavior of the president is yet another aspect of this. And I think you're right. After the episode with President Trump walking across the street from the White House to the church, for most Republicans, I think that is a step too far, because for the most strict conservative people among us, the separation of the United States military and civilian police powers is sacred. That is not something that should be breached. Only in the most drastic of circumstances, where literally hundreds, if not thousands of lives would be at stake. And clearly that wasn't the situation here. And the other aspect of this, which I think people see through, the notion of holding up a Bible is so foreign to most people's understanding of the role of religion in America in the context of politics by a president, and I'm not judging his religious beliefs, but by a president that doesn't ordinarily instill or invoke the values that undermine or that provide the foundation of religious belief in America. And so people saw through it. And I think even his most loyal Republican allies are uncomfortable with this joinder of events. And they just want to distinguish themselves from it. They want the news cycle to change. And the fact of the matter is, though, we have a lot of work to do in the United States. All of us have a lot of work to do. And not in a partisan sense, but I think Joe Biden said something the other day that was quite insightful. And I won't do it justice, but essentially he said for most of his political career, he felt that we Americans, that we could defeat hatred. And what he seemed to say now is that what he's learned is that, in fact, we may not be able to defeat it because hatred hides. And it hides until the point in which there's an opportunity to come out of hiding. And that's what we have here. Hatred has come out of hiding, and we all need to understand our individual and our collective role in addressing this problem. And for those of us who are not African American, we need to put ourselves in the shoes of African Americans. And we need to do it from a sympathetic and a sensitive perspective. And that's what needs to be done. And it shouldn't be different between Republicans and Democrats. No one supports looting. No one supports innocent people's lives being threatened. No one supports property damage. But there's an underlying crisis that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much. And Mark, we have seen some extraordinary events, especially in regards to US military, and Robert mentioned it a little bit. For the first time, I see the chairman of Joint Chief of Staff walking around DC with his uniform, especially in a crisis like this. And I was reading your book yesterday, and you mentioned several things. For example, I'm reading a few sentences. You said, if only members of the US military had voted, Trump would have won in a landslide. Hillary Clinton lost the military vote overwhelmingly. And it was a repudiation not only of Clinton's candidacy, but of her service as Barack Obama's Secretary of State. The views of the military rank and file, the polls showed, were also starkly different than those of a number of high-profile officers who supported the former Secretary of State, including Marine General John Allen. So reading about this, and for the last 2 days, Elliot Cohen wrote a piece on The Atlantic saying that America's generals must stand up. And Mike Mullen wrote another piece on The Atlantic saying that I cannot remain silent about what is going on. And if you had a chance to see the Esper's, Secretary of Defense Esper's press conference this morning, he was basically trying to distinguish himself from President Trump's position in regards to use of military in these against these demonstrators. So what is going on between the US military and President Trump, and what is going on among the members of US military?
Well, I find myself agreeing with what Robert said, that there has been a tradition in the United States of the separation of military powers from local police powers. And over the last few days, we've seen kind of a slop over between the two, or an attempted slop over between the two. And it's caused real anxiety inside the military, and especially among the upper ranks. You mentioned Mark Milley's appearance in Lafayette Park and escorting the president to St. John's Church. And this, I mean, my phone lit up when this happened. Of former senior retired and currently retired and even currently serving military officers. One of whom said to me, a colonel out at Fort Leavenworth, said, "Mark, what is he doing?" There is real discomfort inside the military with talk of deploying military forces to aid local police forces in putting down demonstrations or riots. And I think that we saw from Secretary of Defense this morning a kind of a backing off from that. People would say, and I think that Elliot Cohen might say, that our civil military relations are in tatters. I'm not sure I'd go that far. So long as we have senior military officers who are willing to question orders and say, well, Mr. President, we understand what you're saying and we agree with you, but let's rethink that. So long as we have military officers who are willing to do that, I think our civil military relations will survive the current crisis. Let me just add a second part. There's a division inside the military itself between senior military officers who tend to be more liberal. They're not liberal, they're conservative, but they're not as conservative as the men and women in the ranks, who are very conservative. And primarily Southern, and they've been on serial deployments in the Middle East and Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria for the last 10 years, deployment after deployment after deployment. And the appeal of them to Trump consists solely in his willingness to get us out of those wars. And he has promised that before the election, we'll be out of Afghanistan. That's likely to gain him a lot of military votes. And it's likely to gain him a lot of support from the American people. I say that knowing that we are in the midst of two major crises, the aforementioned George Floyd crisis, the local policing crisis, that is, and coronavirus. These are domestic issues, and they're likely to overawe any kind of feeling that anyone has about Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. So I think that the outlook here for the short term and probably for the next 4 years is a nation that is consumed primarily with domestic policy issues: taxing, education, immigration, infrastructure, healthcare. And that we're entering an era where foreign policy issues probably take a secondary position. And I think it's become apparent to the American people that, over the next 4 years, we're going to have to start to get our house in order. That too many issues have been unresolved for too long, and that's what they'll expect from the president. And who's ever elected in November will probably be elected on domestic and not foreign policy issues.
We will talk about elections in the second part. When we were organizing this webinar, actually, the most significant crisis was Corona crisis, and probably considering more than 100,000 people died so far, and considering that we still do not have any vaccination or medication, and people like Dr. Fauci is extremely concerned about a second wave or second peak in the summer. There is this major question: in the next 4 months, 5 months, we will have a presidential election, a congressional election. And what do you think the impact of the COVID-19 crisis be on the election? Mark, shall we start with you, since you left at that point, and then we will go to Congressman?
I'm going to take off my foreign policy analyst hat, and I'm going to put on my historian's hat.
Yeah. Tell us a good story, Mark.
I'll try to tell you a good story. Well, here it is. I keep hearing from my friends and colleagues in the press and in the military that, and I think people generally say, and it sounds right, that the coronavirus has changed everything. And you hear this often. You hear people say, this COVID stuff, it's changed everything. Nothing will ever be the same again. We had better prepare for a new world. Mm-hmm. Well, if you go back in history and you look at the other major health crises in human history, the most recent being the plague in Europe in the 1600s. Well, people were saying the same thing then. Things like, the plague is going to change everything. It's going to end feudalism. It's going to do that. It's going to do that. It did nothing. Nothing changed. And so I think it's possible to exaggerate. I mean, here we are in the middle of it. It seems like a major crisis, and in many respects it is, but I'm not sure it changes everything. Yes, there will be more remote learning. But I think that what the crisis has done is it's highlighted the fragility of our healthcare system. And this is we've known for a long time that our health insurance and healthcare system needs to really be looked at and reformed and dealt with. And if anything brought that home, it was this coronavirus. So I would imagine that, healthcare is already number one on everyone's list of things that need to be done in the new administration or in this one. I think that view is now undergirded by the coronavirus. We are going to have to deal with a broken healthcare system at the end of this crisis and really dig in hard to figure out how we prepare, how we cover people, how we can pay for another crisis like this, and how we prepare for another crisis like this, and whether our healthcare infrastructure is adequate to deal with it, and it's not. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a debate between Trump and Biden. This will be the debate. It'll be on the healthcare system. I think that's what the corona virus has done, other than, the psychological impact, which I don't have the expertise to deal with, of everyone being vulnerable to a pandemic nobody predicted. I don't know how that affects us psychologically, but it certainly will. But I think that politically, there's no question that healthcare and health insurance and the health insurance programs will be the number one issue in the fall election. And that will be the result of this coronavirus crisis.
Before I'm going to Congressman, Mark, you mentioned that the next presidency will be a domestic politics presidency, but isn't this the case? In 1992 election, it was the economy stupid. It was the Clinton administration main agenda was domestic politics. In 2000 election, and in Clinton period, we started to see Bosnia crisis, Somalia crisis, Rwanda crisis, Iraq, Afghanistan, everything. And in 2000, it was again the domestic agenda of the George W. Bush presidency. And then 9/11 happened, Iraq happened. And then it was Obama that supposed to put the house in order. And we started to see the Syria crisis, Arab Spring, and everything. Maybe the agenda of the winning, candidates are always the domestic agenda, but it turns out to be a foreign policy crisis that changes everything. So how can we be so sure that it was domestic?
I will amend and extend my remarks. Mm-hmm. Barring a major international crisis, are the issues which are going to consume Americans over the next 4 years will be domestic. But I don't see an international crisis on the horizon, and I don't see anyone trying to pick a fight with us. Well, I know China is on the agenda, but I don't think we're going to have World War III with China. So I would maintain my thesis that we are going to be digging in on domestic policies for the foreseeable future.
Congressman, the COVID's impact to US elections, what would you expect? In your experience, both the presidential election and congressional elections, of course.
Sure. For me, the overriding impact is uncertainty. We just cannot, we never could have predicted the future, but now we have been shown that we can't predict the future. And I think an attempt to do so is pointless. No doubt domestic concerns led by healthcare will be the number one issue. And it's not my expertise, but I suspect that the nature of warfare, for instance, may in the future dramatically be impacted by the lessons of the coronavirus. I hope not, I pray not, but I wonder if it will be. And if there is an element of that, then what are the financial and security implications of such a change? We're so busy defending ourselves against intercontinental missiles, and possibly what the vulnerabilities in our healthcare system shows us is that different kinds of weapons in the future may be far more potent than we ever want to think about in terms of warfare. these kinds of questions the next president will have to deal with. More mundane questions that result from the coronavirus. The future of commercial real estate, not something a lot of us think about unless you're in the commercial real estate industry. But the future of commercial real estate may be entirely different, which may change dramatically economic pictures in many cities in America. Now, will it be just a negative, or is it an opportunity to convert commercial real estate to residential housing? Again, beyond my expertise. But I think we are entering into such a period of uncertainty where there will be dramatic evolutions in certain industries, in certain parts of government that we can't begin to predict. The one thing I think that we should talk about, though, and I guess maybe you'll get to it, is that, and I say this without judgment, although I have a judgment, the approaches of President Trump versus Vice President Biden to how America engages in the world could not be more different. And I think it's fair to say that President Trump's America First policies, as they're applied to our international relations, essentially are policies designed to separate us and withdraw us from the world. And Vice President Biden's policies, similar to President Obama's, are exactly the opposite. They are to engage us with the world, to partner us with our allies, to find common ground. Now, no doubt President Trump and his allies would say, no, I'm misrepresenting possibly the idea that the Trump approach is one of separation and withdrawal. But I was counting up in preparation of this talk the number of treaties or agencies that the Trump administration, I believe, has withdrawn from in the last 3.5 years. And you counted up the World Health Organization, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Pact, the Paris Climate Accord, the Iran nuclear deal, of course. I think it was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia, UNESCO, the Open Skies Treaty, and of course, President Trump at times has threatened to pull us out of NATO. Now, we can debate the validity or the merit of each one of those individual actions. And even if your viewers may agree with this withdrawal or that withdrawal, the overall impact is unquestionable. America is withdrawing from the organized world. And what is most striking is we are withdrawing from the very institutions and structure that we, as the victors in World War II, created, and which has largely benefited America and our allies since World War II. And so, to me, that is the international dynamic that that the American voters will be faced with in terms of when they go to the polls. One last thing, if I may. Sure. Probably the most pragmatic and important implication of the coronavirus in terms of the election is the manner in which we vote. And unfortunately now, the manner in which we vote has become a partisan issue. In my humble opinion, the notion that voting by mail is subject to additional fraud and fraught with inappropriate results bears no resemblance to facts. And the direction that we ought to be headed, and certain states are already headed there, is to prepare for largely mail-in ballot elections. My state of Florida, the idea that senior citizens in large numbers are going to be asked in November, when we might, I hope not, but might be in the middle of some element of a second wave, are going to have to weigh the risk of health results for going to vote versus absentee ballots or vote by mail is insane. And so we will have mostly Democratic governors preparing for mail-in voting, and I presume many Republican governors doing the opposite, led by the president. And this will likely be a traumatic problem because the structure of voting, which goes to the integrity of the election, should not be a partisan issue, but it appears like it will be a very strident partisan issue.
So I started to receive some questions from the audience, so I will integrate my questions with them. Amr Darag asks a question. Some analysts have been talking about an ugly scenario of a civil war that is associated with Trump not accepting loss in elections and calling his supporters to the streets. The current events may add another catalyst for such scenario. Maybe if Trump decides to postpone the elections, if he assesses that he will lose. How serious scenarios like this are for both guests? Mark, shall we start with you?
I don't think it's serious. I don't think that there's going to be a postponed election. I don't think Trump is even considering postponing the election. I don't know how you would do that.
Has there been any postponed elections in the history, Mark?
No.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't. I mean, I don't worry about that. What I thought, but I'll give the questioner a lot of credit for thinking about, some of the aspects of this, because what was interesting in the midst of the coronavirus crisis was the formation of state coalitions to deal with coronavirus guidances that would be in agreement with each other. So you had the emergence of New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, kind of a Northeast coalition to deal, to shape a regional response to the crisis. You had the emergence of Nevada, California, Oregon, Washington, a kind of a Cascadia coalition. And I think that we were fairly close to a real kind of a 10th Amendment crisis with the Trump administration and the various states over policies. And we still might face this crisis because if the US Congress does not vote budgetary relief for some of these states, they're facing bankruptcy, which they cannot face. And they may decide to raise revenues on their own, which is a constitutional crisis. Now, we're not there. I don't know if we're going to get there. But I watched this very closely, and it gave me kind of the willies because, this dates back 200 years now to the 1830s when South Carolina just decided they would ignore federal law on a tariff, which was called nullification, where they just nullified the federal law, and Andrew Jackson threatened to send federal troops, and it was a civil crisis and a constitutional crisis. And something like that is not, out of the question, but a postponement of the next election on the part of Trump, I think that there could be problems over the next election. If the election is very close and contested, then we may have challenges from Trump or from his contender, presumably Mr. Biden. But I don't think it could happen, but I do think it's unlikely.
Congressman?
I would agree that the likelihood of a postponed election is very small or zero. However, unfortunately, I don't think the idea or the notion of a contested election in a way that is in a way that undermines the legitimacy of the election is far-fetched. Right. If you go back to the election of 2000 as contentious as that election recount was, and I know it well, and as hurtful to many as it was, think back to then Vice President Gore's concession speech, which was one of the most magnanimous speeches made in our modern political time. And at least for the moment, what Vice President Gore did is he allowed the nation to move forward in some unified fashion with a legitimacy bestowed upon President George W. Bush. I don't have the type of confidence that if the circumstances are such that President Trump finds himself in a similar situation that Vice President Gore found himself, that we would, as a nation, receive the same magnanimous speech. I could imagine a very different result. And as violent and as uncomfortable as the last several days have been, I can't even imagine, I don't want to imagine what would occur given the way that President Trump uses language to incite people to do things at times, which is, unthinkable. I think it's even sad that we're talking about it, but I think this is the reality in which we now live.
Congressman, what kind of changes do you expect in campaign season? So probably we will not have large rallies. We may not even have town hall meetings. So do you expect a much more digital election campaign, or do you think by the end of summer we will start to have those town hall meetings as well?
I think we'll have town hall meetings. They'll be more controlled. They'll be under certain circumstances, but surely digital engagement will be more significant. I suspect the presidential debates will actually be more important than usual. And the fact that it's President Trump, he tends to generate excitement and interest on all sides. And I suspect we would have record numbers of Americans watching those debates, assuming that we would have them and assuming that both candidates would agree as they ordinarily do. But again, it's the unknown. And we'll have unprecedented amounts of money spent on advertising on social media. And I suspect they're, again, given the uncertainty of the voting process itself, which depending on what happens with the coronavirus, there will be opportunities for outsiders, whether it's Russia or Iran or China or whomever, to create chaos if we're not careful in terms of our voting process security.
Just another question. There are some debates that President Trump has been using the press conferences on COVID as almost a part of his election campaign, whereas Biden didn't have a chance, like this, at least on TVs. So do you think this would be a disadvantage for Biden? The fact that President Trump is having press conferences for different issues every day, has incumbency effect, has more visibility. Do you think this would impact Biden's chance of winning the election?
The incumbent always has advantages. There's no question about that. And every challenger has to figure out the way to overcome those disadvantages. And the way this has worked out is at the beginning, President Trump may have seemed to have been benefited by the public exposure, but it seems by the end he may not have benefited. And the same applies to the circumstances now with the current situation. President Trump tends to overplay his hand, and the American people, I think, are wise to that. But that remains to be seen. I don't fault for President Trump for taking advantage of the incumbency of the president. He would be foolish not to. And Vice President Biden knows what the advantages are, having been a part of a ticket that ran for re-election. And so he also knows how an opponent must take on the advantages of the incumbent. But that's what makes for winning and losing campaigns.
Mark, before I skip to the foreign policy questions, a general question about one-term presidents. In the last probably 40 years, we have Carter, and in 1980, losing the election, and we have George H. Bush, 1992. Do you see any resemblance that they were having in their last 5 months with Trump presidency?
You'd have to go back pretty far in history to come up with a similar scenario to the one we have now. I think that Mr. Carter's one-term presidency, the reason that Mr. Carter had a one-term presidency, he was hobbled in the last 5 months of his presidency by a crisis in Iran, a foreign policy crisis. We don't have one now. Mm-hmm. This is a reach. In many respects, what we're seeing in this country because of the Trump presidency is unprecedented. It's unique. We've never had a president quite like this. The one presidency that always comes to mind was the failed presidency of James Buchanan, which brought us Abraham Lincoln. And the last months of the Buchanan presidency were hobbled. He wasn't even considered for re-election. That's certainly not the case with Trump. But I go back to failed presidencies as kind of a model for what we have now. It is truly unique, and I take Robert's point. I think he's exactly right. The incumbent here, Mr. Trump, has certain advantages, and I don't think it's I hear people all the time saying, well, Mr. Trump can't win re-election. Well, he certainly can. And we saw how fast the coronavirus came and how fast the George Floyd crisis kind of set upon us. It's hard to make a prediction with 4 months left or 5 months or 6 months left before the election. Anything can happen. Mm-hmm. But the one thing that I found interesting over the last 2 weeks is the fact that Joe Biden hasn't appeared that much in public has actually redounded to his benefit. Mm-hmm. It's made him look to be what he is, a very serious and empathetic man. And the more that Trump has kind of strutted around, the more he looks diminished. Mm-hmm. And that's a very interesting kind of series of events because it shows how serious the American people are getting about the situation we're facing. They don't want a show, they want results. And Mr. Trump has seemed fairly ham-handed in providing those results.
Thank you. And 2 foreign policy questions. The first one is on Middle East. And Amr asks, if domestic issues will dominate elections, how do you expect the US policy in the Middle East will be in future? Let's say in either Trump 2.0 or Biden presidency. Mark, shall we start with you?
I think that Mr. Trump's, I'll go back to my earlier remarks, my opening remarks. I think that Mr. Trump's pledge that we would get out of these wars in Afghanistan, Syria, and Iraq resonates, not just in the military, with the American public. And I would consider the drawdown of our forces there a foregone conclusion. I think the second interesting thing about what's happening in the Middle East is what's not happening in the Middle East. And what's not happening in the Middle East is we are not involved in Libya. It's absolutely off the radar. Under Obama or a Hillary Clinton administration, say, or under a Bush administration, that would have never happened. We would have kept our hand in. That's no longer the case. I think the third thing that is of more than passing importance is that the Trump administration has basically ceded the momentum in the peace process it sounds almost like a literary conceit now in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process, has ceded the ground to Israel. And that's going to be very difficult to walk back. And I'm not sure that Vice President Biden is going to walk it back. In some sense, on all of these foreign policy issues, this is water under the bridge now. I take Robert's point about all these international agreements. I think some of them are irreparable, and it's going to be one of Joe Biden's real foreign policy primary agenda items is to kind of repair our relationship with our friends. And to, maybe we can rejoin the TPP, maybe we can re-up Open Skies. But there are some things that are done deals. And the Middle East, I think, is a done deal. The military wants out, the American people want out, we're getting out, and I think I would place it at, I don't place anything as a category of certainty, but I think that that's a certainty.
Congressman?
I would agree with Mark in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan. No question that the focus will be on removing American troops, removing American assets, and putting an end to that chapter in our history. I think maybe the first thing in terms of international focus that Vice President Biden would do would be to address global climate change. And whether that comes in terms of resurrecting the agreements of the past or even trying to make better ones, I think that will be a monumental effort that will get extraordinary focus, maybe even a special cabinet member appointment that focuses entirely on it. And in many ways, it would drive elements of the new Biden administration's foreign policy. The trade agreement in the Pacific, I think, would be resurrected because it is arguably the finest display of American soft power that we have created in the modern political arena. If you really want to corner or combat China's influence, particularly in terms of its nefarious behavior, there's no better way to do it than to create an economic blanket around China that both enhances America's trade relations and protects our allies in the Pacific. It's such an extraordinary show of American strength. I would foresee that Vice President Biden would return to that effort. Again, he may try to make a better deal. He may try to improve upon it, but that would be a focus. Vice President Biden has said many times that he would seek to once again negotiate with Iran. Doesn't mean that he would enter back into the Iran nuclear agreement per se. I hope that what would be included this time, which wasn't last time for a variety of reasons, is the inclusion of all of Iran's nefarious behavior beyond the nuclear behavior, and that would all be on the negotiation table. We need to do that for ourselves, but we also need to do that for our Gulf allies and for the state of Israel. With respect to Israel and the Palestinians, I do think we would have a dramatically different approach. And not so much in terms of an unrealistic quest for a negotiated two-state solution right away. Everyone appreciates that's not on the horizon. However, I do believe that a Biden administration would seek both the Israelis and the Palestinians, as well as the United States and the international community, to take coordinated steps that improve the lives of Israelis and Palestinians, that increase security for Israelis and Palestinians, and at the same time narrow the conflict. And there are many steps that all of the parties can take that are consistent with their security interests, that also improve lives, and that in a different environment with the leadership of an American administration that sought to find some common ground, there could be again building of some trust between the parties, which of course does not exist at all today. Just as an example, and I don't want to dwell on this, but moving the embassy, the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, essentially was a bipartisan position in the United States for some period of time. I voted for it on several occasions. And I know very few Democrats that don't consider Jerusalem to be the rightful capital of the state of Israel. Of course it is. It's where the prime minister's office is. It's where the Knesset is. It's where the Israeli Supreme Court is. But look what's happened since we've moved our embassy to Jerusalem. I think there's only been one other country, a relatively minor one in terms of foreign policy, who has followed us. For those of us who care so deeply about the Israeli-American relationship, I had hoped that when America moved our embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, that dozens of nations would follow us because they would see it as a just and moral and appropriate thing to do. And so I think if he wins election, President Biden will seek a policy more in that regard, a policy that is just as supportive of Israel's security interests as President Trump or President Obama or any other president, arguably even more, but at the same time, one that was viewed as being more sympathetic to the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people for self-determination. And that's where I think America loses internationally at this point, because we are perceived by many as having not only been pro-Israel, which we should be, and we should be unapologetically in my mind, but you don't need to be adverse to Palestinians in order to be favorable to Israelis. In fact, I would argue just the opposite, that to be favorable to Palestinian interests in certain respects actually bolsters Israel's position in many regards. And I think that would change dramatically in a very significant positive way under President Biden.
So deal of the century will not be on the table anymore.
Well, I think there are no, under President Biden, no, but I think there are elements of it that Israel would demand would be, and I think this was part of Mark's point, that Israel's not going to be anxious or eager to move back from the Trump agreement. And so I think what President Biden would need to do is to take certain elements of the Trump plan and try to apply them in a way that is more favorable or more sympathetic to Palestinian interests. And in fairness, even now, Jared Kushner says that asks the Palestinians to come up with their own proposal. Now they haven't done so. I do believe there are ways to negotiate, keeping in mind certain of the principles that the Trump plan put out there that could be incorporated into a Biden strategy. But in total, you're right. You can't have Israel annexing or taking 30% of the West Bank and expect that the Palestinians will ever accept that type of taking. And if you look at the map that the Trump plan calls for, it literally cuts the West Bank into 3 different sections. The Palestinians would not have territorial contiguity. Those kinds of issues, I believe, a Biden administration would reverse in terms of the expectation.
The second foreign policy question is on China. And I know we talk about that the election will be mostly on domestic issues, but considering the corona crisis and considering increasing unemployment rate, China seems to be kind of, like the half foreign policy, half domestic politics issue. So what would you expect either from Trump 2.0 or Biden presidency about the policy on China? we have seen the debates now on Taiwan. Secretary Pompeo tweeted about Taiwan, supporting Taiwan's membership, participation to World Health Organization. Hong Kong issue, there is President Trump announced that the privileges of Hong Kong would be revoked. And on top of that, the Congress sent a new bill, Uyghur human rights bill, to US President Trump right now. So there are a lot of issues. In addition to that, we have South China Sea, we have trade war, and we have the corona crisis. So this will be probably big. And when I look at the questions, there are some questions coming on China issue. What should we expect from these two candidates after the elections on China? Congressman, let's start with you.
Clearly, one of President Trump's main strategy points throughout the election will be to blame China for the coronavirus and then the economic consequences. He will make the case that he was the first to tell everyone that we need to close our borders, America first, and he stopped the flights and so forth. We can debate the merits of that. We can debate even the truthfulness of what he's saying, but he will do that, and undoubtedly he will do it well. That is vintage, President Trump type of tactics. The problem that he's got is he's got a delicate balancing act. I think I saw some news reports where he is considering, or the Trump administration is considering, banning Chinese flights to the United States. The balancing act he's got is that he needs the stock market to continue to perform relatively well.
That's right.
And he needs strong support in the business community in America. And like it or not, and we need to no doubt reduce our dependency or our interdependency with China, particularly as it relates to healthcare and things of that nature. That was brought out to most Americans. We can't be dependent on pharmaceutical products from China or even things like masks. However, every time you strike as an American administration against China, you are striking potentially at the American economy. So he's going to have a very delicate balance. This is way into the weeds, but if we're going further and further into debt, it means we are further and further more reliant upon international buyers of our debt. So the Chinese will not just turn around and ignore our punitive behavior towards them, they will strike back. And if President Trump goes into the election in the middle of a trade war, I suspect that causes him more damage than he benefits politically. Now, subsequent to an election, if he were to win election, I think he will do what's best for his politics and what's best for the American economy. So I understand the emotion that people have, and certainly we need to change certain of our policies and bring our manufacturing home, particularly in essential industries. But the go after China at all costs strategy, as appealing as it might be politically or emotionally, will have unintended economic consequences that do not help American workers.
Mark?
Yeah, I agree entirely with that. And let me just add something I've been noticing over the last 2 weeks. There's a lot of rhetoric coming out of our military about the malign influence of China, a phrase that used to be reserved for Iran. And now, they've used the phrase malign influencer to describe China. And you hear a lot of military officers talking about the inevitable confrontation and military competition that we're going to have with China. And I don't buy it. And the reason I don't buy it, a lot of the anti-China rhetoric, is that if you take a look at what the military services are doing, I noticed that 2 weeks ago, the Marine Corps put out a new vision 2030, where they basically stripped out all the armor out of the Marine divisions the Air Force has a new restructuring program out there, whatever, Vision 2024, or whatever it is. And it basically recasts Air Force structures, command structures. Now, I hear military officers praise these programs and these plans and these visions. But what these visions really reflect is what the military thinks is going to happen to them over the next 4 to 8 years, which are budget cuts. And they're preparing for it. They're trying to shape the force structure that they have to reflect the money that they're going to get. They are clearly convinced that what's going to happen is that military budgets are going to be pared back. It's not going to be a steep cut as it was during the Clinton years, but there's going to be a little bit of austerity imposed in the military and defense department. Certainly, I think Secretary of Defense Esper has his own murder boards going through the budget seem to suggest that. So at the same time that we're talking about a military competition with China and a possible confrontation with China, our military is preparing for just the opposite. So I think that what we might expect over the next 4 years and longer is what we had to an nth degree with the Soviet Union. We're going to have a foreign policy establishment and presidents who manage our relationship with China, who work through the trade aspects and the South China Sea competition that we have. Are we, is this a Thucydides trap? Or whatever it's called. I don't think so. I think that, there's a lot of things that we have in common, and the congressman is right. We, whether we like it or not, nobody's going to turn the clock back on globalization. It's not going to happen. And a big part of globalization are the kind of trade relationships we have with our Pacific partners, with the TPP, if it gets revived, and also recasting our trade relationship with China, which will be recast. So I'm very skeptical of this. We are headed for a crisis with China. There's no need for such a crisis. And certainly deep down in the weeds of the Pentagon, they're not preparing for one, and they don't want one.
Our time is almost up. There are some short questions that I will ask our panelists. One, do you expect any action of President Trump against Esper after his press conference today? President Trump is known to be not very favorable to the people who publicly basically opposes his viewpoints. And after Esper's statements today, do you expect a tweet from President Trump or worse, like firing him? Mark?
Oh, I think that Trump would probably be upset with what Esper said today, but Secretary Esper has a key ally in the administration, and that is his West Point classmate, Mike Pompeo. And Mike Pompeo has the ear of the president, and Mike Pompeo will step in at the last minute to save Mark Esper from his fate. Although predicting Trump is a bad thing to do. Predicting what the president is going to do is a losing proposition. So who knows? But I think that I'd be surprised if Esper was fired, and I think who knows, it'd be a mistake. I don't think he's been a particularly good Secretary of Defense, although I wrote an article once in praise of him. But I think that, we need stability in the government. We can't be firing Secretaries of Defense every drop of the hat. So I think he's probably okay.
Congressman?
I would agree with Mark and just add that the secretary actually did the president a great favor today, and he did it artfully. He, and I did hear the press conference. I don't think he in any way was particularly confrontational with the president. And I think he did calm people's nerves in a way that allows now the president to move forward in a more positive direction if he chooses to do so. So it would, and I think Republican members of Congress would come to the secretary's defense, because I think he has a lot of support in Congress, and he didn't say anything that controversial or adverse to the president.
There is one technical question. Dan Lieberman asks, can electors resign and refuse to cast their votes, which would prevent a Trump majority and throw the nomination to the convention?
Can the
electors, Republicans.
We'd have to check the Republican Party rules. And that would be determined oftentimes by each state in terms of how delegates are chosen. Normally on the first ballot, each delegate is bounded by law to vote for a candidate that he or she was chosen to represent, assuming that candidate is still in the race. So I can't imagine that there's a scenario where that could happen in any realistic form. And quite frankly, President Trump is still incredibly favorably viewed by most Republicans. So there wouldn't, not only is there not a legal strategy, I don't believe, to do that, but there's no political strategy. He is the favorable nominee of the Republican Party, which, getting back to a previous discussion, that distinguishes himself from Jimmy Carter, who had a pretty rough primary with Ted Kennedy in 1980. Mm-hmm. Nobody's running against, nobody of significance is running against President Trump. There is no contest in the Republican Party, and that's for good reason. President Trump enjoys extraordinary support amongst Republicans.
Mark, what do you think?
Oh, I have no disagreement. I expect that Trump, wherever they hold their convention, will be the nominee, and I think that Vice President Biden will be the nominee in the Democratic Party, and this is where we are.
So this will be the last question. We have a few more questions, but we don't have much time. So the last question is from Ellen Vasilina, and she asks, healthcare will be a determining factor in the next elections. What can the US do to ensure healthcare coverage to all of its citizens, like most advanced economies in the world? Competitiveness depends on the health of its citizens. How can the US stay competitive? You want to start first, Congressman?
Sure. Well, if it's President Biden, he will go back to Obamacare and improve Obamacare. And he might go back to Obamacare and try to reduce possibly the age of Medicare eligibility. He may more forcefully entertain the option of some element of a public option plan. But he's not going to do a Senator Sanders type of universal plan. But the goal will be universal coverage. And the fact is, if you take the partisan politics out of the discussion regarding Obamacare, it was beginning to work in the context of more and more people being insured. Now, there are certainly people in the insurance industry and in the hospital industry that could offer, I suspect, improvements to Obamacare. But that's the direction that President Biden will go, no doubt. As to President Trump, I don't know. I don't know what he'll do in terms of offering healthcare reform that would pass muster with Republicans. I'm not sure.
Mark, do you want to add anything for this?
No, the only thing I would add is that I think that Robert's characterization here is exactly right on what Mr. Biden will probably do. And I would just add to his last comment that he doesn't know what Trump will do because Trump doesn't know what he's going to do, which is part of the problem with the current administration. We would love to know what their preferences are on China and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and trade and infrastructure and all of it. But the reason we don't know their preferences is because they don't know them. And that might well be the issue that stands above all others in the coming election.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Congressman, and thank you for all the viewers and audience. And we hope to see you in our next webinar next week. Thanks a lot, and see you again.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.